The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I am Al Warren, Mr. David North Rose Killer Martino is back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
I'm back with all the names.
All the names. And you posted
All the
that
names.
review about the new Jason movie.
Oh, yeah, Michael Myers, yeah.
Yeah, same thing.
Yeah, I do the same thing.
Yeah. They're all the same.
Halloween
Turn them upside
ends.
down, they look the same.
Halloween ends, can we be so lucky?
Oh, yeah, well, you know, it won't. This is going to be going on long past our lifetimes, you know.
Yes.
Another atrocious movie, you know. And you were saying it's not, so there's not even a lot of really good killing in it either.
No, good first scene.
Yeah.
First scene has a nice bone-crunching scene, but then after that, it's kind of...
Well, why didn't they just do that and then end it?
I know, that'd be perfect.
Put it on
Roll
TikTok.
credits.
Yeah, put it on TikTok and run it as a video. That's
perfect.
good
You're a
enough.
genius, Al.
I am. I tell you, I need to be running this. I'll make Jason or Michael Myers, whatever. They're all the same.
They're the same, yeah.
You know, it's just same thing, mask or whatever. So, anyway, well, COVID's just about done. I've just about won.
That's right.
Just about.
You sound like you got some energy and you're ready to rock.
Oh, it's just the caffeine. Don't buy into that. But yeah,
Smoking
no,
berries.
the ears popped and things sort of are getting better. You know, so no more of that. Okay, don't be passing around any more of that nastiness. Okay,
That's right. No more.
You're bad.
No more infecting you, Al.
Yeah. Well, anyway. Well, you know, at this point, we talk about nastiness and bad horror. So we've got a guest that writes horror, and anyway, so we'll bring him out because he's got a new book out, and the new book is called "A Child Alone with Strangers." It's a novel. So, Mr. Philip Fracassi, thank you for being here.
Hey, Alan, thank you for having me.
We haven't had you yet.
I was trying not to giggle the whole time you guys were talking because I didn't want to interrupt. But
Well, you know, we've had people hang up on us. So, you know, let's go with it.
Right.
So what's going on in Philip's life? Like, what is so bad about your life that you have to write such horror stories?
nothing, man. I'm good. You know, it's just I write horror for the thrill of it. I find it incredibly fun and entertaining. And it's you know, it's one of those things where you know, it's like once you get the bug for it and once you get that first rush of reading a great horror novel or seeing a really scary horror movie, it's like one thing you want to emulate that. And so I have a lot of fun writing my scary stories.
Well, I'm not a professional at horror. So when I see or read a book that's horror, I sort of kind of get, I either like the real scary suspense part of it, or I want the real slasher blood and guts.
Right.
Like, you know, we just talked about, I know that Dave does reviews, he writes horror, and he does reviews on these movies, and, you know, like the new Michael Myers, it's not really a good story, and it's not really a good thing, and then plus it's not even really violent or anything. So I don't see any winners in this. But what to you is a good horror story? Like, what do you look for?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm not a huge slasher guy either. You know, as far as the fan of that kind of stuff, I watch it for fun. But yeah, I think for horror, like first, I think the genre of horror has unfortunately a lot of misconceptions for people who haven't read a lot of it or seen a lot of it. Movies, you know, they tend to think it's all like vampires and serial killers or zombies or whatever. And the reality is, you know, horror is a pretty wide range of fiction, you know, on the fiction side. There's psychological horror, there's supernatural thrillers with horror elements, then there's like splatterpunk, and there are, you know, the slashers and the tropes like vampires and and what have you. But to me, what makes a good horror book is the same thing that makes any book good, which is that the characters have to live and breathe. The reader needs to be able to empathize with the characters. The interactions with the characters need to be, interesting and provocative. And then to me, the plot comes next, the action, the scares, the thrills, all that kind of comes next, because if you don't buy into the characters, then you're not really buying into all the other stuff, or at least not as much. And that's kind of like what you mentioned with, for an example, Halloween Ends, is sometimes those movies don't really build the characters too much. They're just all about kind of the fun and games sort of thing. So I personally think a good horror novel it's got to be, characters that you invest in. And then from there, hopefully it's a lot of fun and a lot of crazy, good supernatural stuff happens. But that's where I always start with my books anyway.
Well, what got you into this writing business? And I say that not only just writing, but writing the type of books that you do write. Like, were you out killing people and you decided maybe you should write about it, or where did this come from?
No, not yet. So far my hands are clean, but the writing bug struck me early. When I was like in third grade, I remember writing a short story on an assignment, and I'd never written a story before. And the response was so great. The other kids loved it, and the teacher loved it, and all that kind of stuff. And it's sort of like, when an actor goes on stage and hears applause for the first time, it's like you realize, wow, this is pretty cool, and it might even be something I'm sort of good at. And that's an exciting thing when you're a young kid. So I really got the bug early, and I've been writing nonstop really ever since. And I've always read horror. I grew up on Stephen King and Clive Barker and Dean Koontz and those guys. And so I was, I really always enjoyed reading it, but I wasn't really, writing a lot of it. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I was writing, what I would call non-genre fiction, literary fiction. And I wasn't really getting anywhere with it. I had written 3 novels. I'd written 100 short stories, and I wasn't getting any traction. And so around 2010, I started writing screenplays, and oddly enough, I started writing for Disney. I started writing children's movies for Disney, and ended up getting a credit on one of them, a movie called Santa Pups 2, or Santa Pups 2, I think it is. And and then I wrote a movie for Lifetime that was like more of like a ghost story. And so I started writing all these horror scripts, and had meetings with like Blumhouse and CBS, and nothing ever really took off. And then it was just like one of those weird things. It was like this kind of epiphany. About 2014, 2015, I was like, well, shoot, man, maybe I should try writing some of this horror stuff as fiction instead of these kind of character-based stories I've been writing. And I wrote a short story called Mother. I had a friend of mine read it who was a horror author. I sent it out to a small press. They bought it within a day, and that was my first published story. And then from there, it has been, I've had my ups and downs. I've had my bumps, like any new career where you're learning on the job or learning on the go. But since then, it's been kind of this like nonstop, ride, and it's been great. And the last year or so, things have really kind of taken off. I've got some novels coming out now, and I've made some bigger publishing deals. So it's really exciting. But that's kind of really why I started writing horror. Was it was just something that kind of like sparked between what I was doing on the screenwriting side and then what I was doing on the writing side, kind of coming together.
Yeah, it's interesting how it just happens all of a sudden, hey?
Yeah. I can remember the moment vividly. I was working for a marketing agency at the time, and I was walking around the block during lunch, and I was talking to my wife, and I was frustrated because of this. I just gotten a pass from CBS on a pilot that I wrote, and I was sort of frustrated, and I was sort of venting about it, and I was like, I'm just so sick of writing. I'm so sick of writing screenplays. I don't love it. It's all this work, and you have to and then you got actors telling you to change, you got directors telling you to change, you got producers telling you to change it. And at the end of the day, it's not even, it's not art. It's structure. It's a foundation for which other people to build something, which is fine, and the money's good, but it's not it didn't feel great to write it. It wasn't inspiring me. It wasn't fulfilling me. So yeah, I was talking to my wife and I was like, and I literally, it sounds ridiculous. I literally stopped in my tracks and was like, hold on a second. Why don't I start writing horror fiction and see how that goes? And it was this weird, like, lightning bulb moment.
Were you high at the time?
Not at that specific moment. No, I was at work, so I was.
Well, that doesn't mean anything.
No, no, I was more, no, I was just kind of like downtrodden and frustrated, but yeah.
Well, how was it for you transitioning between screenplays and short and long fiction?
There are three completely different approaches to those three things, what you just mentioned. Screenwriting is very much a technical skill. It's very much about structure. It's about, beats and acts and character development, and it has nothing to do with, quote unquote, writing, or at least writing prose. It's dialogue and action, dialogue and action, dialogue and action. And short stories are approached a little bit differently. Short stories are more like almost much more spontaneous, and they're more like a little bit stream of consciousness, that you kind of go with the flow of where your mind takes you. When I start a short story, I always have like an acorn of an idea, and then I kind of let it grow in my brain. I kind of create. I see if characters walk into the room and attach themselves to the to the idea, and if the characters walk in the room, then I kind of see what they're going to do, and all that stuff kind of takes place in my head. And then when I sit down to write, I always want to have an ending in mind. I never want to not know how it's going to end. But other than that, I don't really know how it's going to go. So it's basically this like core idea, and then I know where the destination is, and me writing it is the journey, and that can be. Sometimes I think a story is going to be a couple thousand words, and it ends up being 20,000 words. Sometimes I think it's going to be 20,000 words, and it ends up being 5,000 words. So I try not to worry about that. I try just to let it flow naturally, and then deal with all that stuff in the edits. A novel is sort of an amalgam of the two. It's structure, outlining, intensive outlining, making sure I know exactly what all the beats are. I like to have every chapter outlined. And then because when I start writing, I don't want to worry about what's going to happen next. A novel is an amalgam of the two. I structure it heavily, like I said. I do outlining, intensive outlining, chapter by chapter. I know what I'm going to do. And then when I sit down to write, I just want to write. I don't want to think about where I'm going, what's going to happen next. I just want to focus on the writing, the prose. I want to write. I want it to sound good. I want the characters to live and breathe. I want to focus on the dialogue. And I can't do all that stuff and think about like what's going to happen next in the story. So it's kind of a combination of structure and then that's the first heavy lifting part. And then just writing is I'm focused on the prose and making sure it sounds as good as I want it to. And so those are the three approaches I have to those three kind of different art forms.
Sounds like the characters are important. Like what's your relationship with your characters? So like in your new book here, where you've got the A Child Alone with Strangers, you got Henry Thorne. What is your experience that you have when you're writing Henry Thorne?
Well, Henry is an interesting character because he's a young kid. He's 9 in the book, and he goes through some very traumatic things, both supernaturally and not supernaturally. He just he goes. He has the book is really Henry's journey, and one thing that's interesting about writing kids is that and one reason I kind of enjoy using kids sometimes in my stories is they have a response to things that is very different than an adult's response to things. For one, they're very resilient. For two, they're much more accepting of what's happening. They're less questioning everything about, if something very weird happens, they're more accepting of it being a real possibility. And also the way they're impacted emotionally to trauma and to things that happen to them is so fascinating because their emotions are so raw and innocent. And, once you turn that corner of innocence, all that stuff kind of is your response to all those kind of things is very different. So when you're writing a child, that's the main thing I focus on is not how would I respond to something happening, but how would a child respond to something happening internally, both psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, what would their response be? And I don't, I like Henry. Henry was such a wonderful character because he has this all these childlike characteristics where he's so innocent, and everything that happens to him is such a gut punch because you're cheering for the kid, but at the same time he's got like this sort of iron will. He's strong, and he does stuff that's courageous and brave, and partly because he doesn't know any better. He doesn't, he's not thinking about all the repercussions. He's just being him, and so was a really fun character to dive into, and it's a pretty diverse cast. There's bad guys, there's villains, there's good guys, but everybody has. I like to give all my characters a very three-dimensional casing. The villains are not always bad people. They're not all. They're bad people, but they're not bad people through and through. And I try and emphasize little silver linings about every character, even if it's a horrible villain, a murderer, because I want the reader to really connect with them and see how they maybe got where they've gotten to in life. And the heroes, are also flawed, just like real people are. And so I get very invested in my characters, and I really want to make sure that they're living and breathing, so that, because they carry the story. Ultimately, I don't carry the story as the writer. The characters carry the story. I'm just telling the reader what's happening. You know what I mean? So the characters are the ones who are living it.
When you're writing these characters, do you have, I guess, an inner monologue in your head, in your mind? Can you hear Henry? Can you hear other characters? Do you hear the prose? How do you experience that?
Well, I think partly just because of the way I'm wired, and also partly because of my screenwriting experience, I think very visually, which which plays into my descriptions of things. But I'm very but also with characters, to your point, I write what I see and I write what I hear. And so I do have these little plays going on in my head where I can see and hear, what the characters are saying. And yeah, they all have very unique voices. They all speak differently. One guy in this book is Australian. One guy has spent a large portion of his life in prison and grew up in a poor economic situation prior to that. Henry is still young, so he has his own kind of unique voice. Henry's guardian is a lawyer with, an affluent background. So everyone has their own way of speaking, their own history, that ties into how they speak, and how they act. So yeah, but to answer your question directly, yeah, I definitely hear the voices in my head. And when you're writing screenplays, so much of what you're writing is, the dialogue is such a huge part of what you're writing. And so you have to kind of like really kind of hone that skill of listening to people talk in your head and writing the way they're talking, both like their mannerisms, their tics, the words they use, how they, without getting too over the top about it, because you don't want to distract the reader. You want it to seem very natural. But yeah, that's something that I've just kind of like is a skill I either had or have developed, but that's something that that's the way I have to do it. Is I have to visualize everything and then kind of write what I see. And I'll add to that something that I do a lot of, which I have learned, which has become a skill that I've developed reading a lot of other writers and kind of that kind of stuff, is I try to be very visceral with my prose and with my situations. I subtly, you wouldn't notice it unless I pointed it out, most likely, but I refer to way maybe something, the texture of something feels, or how something smells, or what it sounds like in this room, or little things like that can really draw a reader's imagination into the scene. And so I try to kind of implement a lot of that throughout my work as well, because I really want readers to feel the impact of what they're reading. If somebody's hurt, I want them to feel that hurt. If the car hits a wall, I want them to feel the impact of that. So I try to kind of do that as well. So I'm kind of all sensory mode when I'm writing.
So have you been hearing these voices a lot in your head?
Well,
And you know, do they tell you to do things? You're not doing this while you're driving, are you, or anything? You know, you don't wake up in the middle of the night with a shovel by the bed, do you?
the key is to know which voices to listen to and which voices to ignore. That's the key. And to make sure you never answer them out loud. That's the other thing I've learned.
Well, you could walk around in the mall and nobody would notice.
Yeah, nowadays with the earbuds and everything, you never know. I never know if somebody's crazy or like on the phone.
Yeah, I know. I want to stay home. I just don't want to go out anymore. I'm getting old. It's terrible. Anyway, well, it's kind of an interesting process. So, do your when you're kind of covering this and you're really kind of getting into the describing, you know, the situation, like maybe the smells, the taste, you could feel the crash in the wall, the thud, you know, you're kind of getting into all this stuff like this. What's your writing process like? Do you sort of have to be isolated alone in a room somewhere or in a basement and nobody around, or can you do it with lots of activity going on?
I would say I certainly favor the former. I like definitely being secluded. I like being in my office and with the creepy, usually some sort of creepy soundtrack on, or some music or classical music or something that fits the mood of what I'm writing. Nothing with vocals. I can't do vocals and write at the same time. So no, I do like to be isolated. I think the writing process changes depending on what I'm writing. So, for example, if I'm writing something like a story or maybe even like a screenplay or even maybe part of a novel, some days it's like heavy lifting, right? Like every word feels like you're picking up a stone and moving it over, to another patch of land or something. It's like every word feels like a weight, and you just have to you have to just be determined to keep going and keep plowing through and keep pushing forward. And those days are hard, but you try and get your word count in, and you just try and do the best you can. And if you need to, the thing that's interesting is sometimes when you're writing like that, when it's going that way, you feel like, oh my God, this is so slow, and I'm just like, I can't, this is, and this process is taking such a long time, and it's got to read so boring, and then you read it and you realize it actually sounds pretty good because the reader doesn't know how long it took you to write a sentence. They just they're reading the same pace as they read everything else. So sometimes it's kind of fascinating to me that sometimes the hardest things to write are the things that read the easiest. But when I'm neck deep in a novel or a scene, sometimes it gets a little where it's I'm locked in, pretty good, and I'll kind of just write straight for 3-4 hours, and I've been writing and had my wife walk into my office, and she's like, God, how can you be in here? It's like 100 degrees, and I'll be like, sweating and my jaw clenched and and staring at the monitor like a madman because you get carried away. And those are the best moments, those are the great moments when, I wrote a novel called Boys in the Valley that's coming out next July. And I wrote the last 10,000 words of that novel in one sitting. I just was feverish about it. And it's a great feeling. You end up doing a lot of rewriting when you write like that. But yeah, so it kind of varies depending on, how the flow is going that day. But I try and make sure I get some time definitely in either way so that I get to make some progress.
Your wife is still alive?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah. My poor wife. I mean, I can't, writers' wives and husbands are, angels from heaven because we are not an easy bunch. Writers are not an easy bunch to live with. We're overly sensitive. We're cynical. We're depressed. We're anxious all the time. We live in our heads a lot, and God bless them. They're always. My wife is very supportive. Thank goodness.
I wonder now. So when you say you've really big on the outline and being structured, but you seem to have moments or even hours where you get into the story in your head and you're writing and stuff. So when it comes to writing the story, do you have to be in a certain mood? Does it have to strike you at the right time? Or do you, I mean, because can you plan this? Can you just go, okay, well, next week there's nobody here at the house. I can write all day and all this. Or does that work for you?
No, for sure. I definitely have moments where I'm planning ahead. And that's part of what I was saying earlier when I was saying that I over structure or I over outline, is so that I can have those moments where I can just write and write and write. Because I don't need to, I don't like having to worry about the story, which sounds a little odd. But when I'm writing, I like to worry about telling the story. And so that allows me to have those kind of moments where I can just go.
Like, can you just plan your day and say, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to write from 9 to 5. There's nobody here. House is quiet. Wife's out having an affair, whatever. And can you just sort of sit down and write at that allotted time? Or when you sit down, if you're not in the mood to write, can you still write?
And that's it. Yeah. And so I do plan ahead. So for instance, if I know I have a big, set piece coming up or a big scene coming up, and I'm kind of at the end of my rope where I've been writing all day and I'm maybe a little tired and I'm worn out, I'll hold it off for another day. I'll be like, I'm going to hit this and hit the ground running tomorrow, and tomorrow's going to be the day I write this big scene, because I know it's going to take me, a chunk of time to get it all down. And I don't want to have to stop midstream. I just want to kind of get it all out at once. And yeah, there's sometimes when I have a big project, for example, I'm going to a convention in New Orleans at the beginning of November, and I'm taking a week. I owe this big outline to my publisher for a book that I haven't written yet, but I sold them, and I really need to focus on it. I just need to get away from everything, because I have so many other little projects, and there's things that just come up at home, as everyone knows. And so I'm just taking a week after this convention. I'm going to Mississippi. I'm staying in this. My friend owns this old, house in Mississippi that he, only stays in a couple of times a year. That's empty, and I'm just going to stay in this big old spooky house for a week, and write, focus on outlining this next novel. So, you definitely have to do that if you have the means and the luxury to do those kind of things. I know writers who, go to hotels for 3 days or 4 days or a week if they really need to focus on hitting a deadline or something. So yeah, the answer is yes on both fronts. Sometimes I plan my writing days for sure if I know I have a big scene coming up, or if I'm near the end of a novel. I definitely I want to have a full day uninterrupted, because I don't want to stop until I've done. And then when I have these giant projects, it's good to be able to totally separate yourself from everything else and just, isolate yourself and focus on that one thing, 24/7 without interruption.
Well, you say, you're very structured with outlines and such when it comes to the novel. Do your characters ever take over? Do they ever go off the rails? Do they kind of take the plot with them? Or do you feel like you're in control because of that structure?
I like to think I'm in control, but it does happen. I wrote a novel called The Blue Butterfly, and that's my agent is currently trying to find a home for, and it's a thriller. And I outlined this book to it's a mystery thriller with kind of time travel elements. So the structure is incredibly complex, and I had never really written a true mystery before. Where you have to seed certain things, you have to have red herrings, you have to have misdirection and all that kind of stuff, right? And so you really got to have the whole thing, in my mind. For me as a reader, I'm sure there's some writers that can do it, on the fly. But for me, I wanted to have everything laid out, because I wanted to know where to drop those little seeds and those little moments or whatever. And so this was an incredibly complex story that I was telling. And I would say about halfway through, maybe a little past halfway through, I was writing a scene, and the main character did something that took the story not in a completely different direction, but definitely, veered hard right. And I was like, what are you doing? I was literally angry. To the point where when I was done writing that scene, I went downstairs and my kid was sitting there, having dinner, and I was like, you guys won't believe what just happened. She totally screwed up my book. And I had to spend the next day, refiguring out a bunch of stuff, between that point and the end of the book, and kind of redoing the outline to a degree. So it definitely happens. And I didn't, as a writer, I didn't step in and say, oh, no, get back over here. This is what we're doing. I said, all right, if that's what we're doing, let's do it. But yeah, so that literally happens, and that was the one example, probably the only example I can give where it happened to the effect that I was like, I remember feeling literally angry and frustrated because she did something I didn't want her to do, and it messed me up. So, but for the most part, I tend to stick to the outlines. I mean, it gets complicated when you sell, when you're working with bigger presses, the big five or whatever, and you pre-sell a pitch, or you have to give, and you don't have the book written, you have to give them an outline, and the outline has to be the book. You can't really screw around and kind of go like, well, I decided to change all this stuff and do something. They want what they want what they paid for, and I think there's some wiggle room, and you can kind of work with your editor or whatever. But for the most part, the outline has to be the book, and so you can't really play too loose and wild with that sort of stuff. But for the most part, like I said, the characters tend to do what I would like them to do, and serve the story. But it has happened where a character has taken over a little bit. Yeah.
Well, you could always just leave the country if forget the publisher. They don't like it too bad.
Right.
Oh,
pay them back their advance. I wrote a book called Gothic, which is coming out in February, and it's more of an old school horror book, and the main character is a writer, which is you're not supposed to do that as a writer. You're not supposed to write books about writers. It's very frowned upon, but I did it anyway, because whatever. And anyway, he has that exact issue where he turns in his case, he turns in a book that was not what they had agreed to, and chaos ensues. But there's like a possessed desk and a ghost and all this other stuff. So, but that's so nobody really cares about that stuff. But anyway, that's all. But it was it does happen.
Were you high then too, or?
No, the possessed. No, I don't know where I came up with the idea of a possessed desk, but it's a pretty wild story, I think.
Well, do you have a fascination with supernatural or paranormal and that sort of thing? Because it seems to be a part of what you do a lot. And is there some experiences you've had, or where does that come from?
Well, it's interesting because I really love writing stuff with supernatural elements because it really takes off the handcuffs. It really takes. There are no rules. And the story can go anywhere. And I love that. I love that a story can go literally anywhere. When I first wrote Child Alone with Strangers, and this is 2 agents ago, he wanted me to write it, to take out all the supernatural stuff and just make it a crime novel, because he's like, look, this is a great crime novel, but why do you need all this crazy monsters in the woods and telepathic kids and all this stuff? And I'm like, because that's the fun part. That's what makes the story wild, and that's what makes it unexpected. And for me as a writer, it's what I want to enjoy what I'm writing as much as I want the reader to enjoy what they're reading. So I got to have fun with it too. But I love the idea of writing horror and stuff with supernatural, because, like I said, it lets you go anywhere and do anything. Anything can happen to the characters. Anything can happen to that world. And for me, that's what really, like, just the sandbox is, eternal. And so that for me is why I'm drawn to it. I don't necessarily, I don't like, being restricted by reality. Now that said, I've written books that are very much restricted by reality and that deal with very real human everyday issues. But when I write genre fiction, I'd like to just kind of like really go crazy with it. And everything has to serve the story, obviously, but I think people like it when you surprise them, right? I mean, we're at a point where we're also saturated with stories, with streaming and, books and podcasts and all this stuff. And it's so hard to come up with something original. So you want to just have an original voice, but you're telling a story that's been told before, and I don't, shy away from that. You're just telling it in your own way. This is a Philip Fracassi version of this story or whatever. But I think people like to be surprised and they like to be caught off guard. And I think that's part of the fun of reading a horror book.
Well, I'm wondering, how did you get involved with the horror community? I found the old Shocklines forum way back in the early 2000s. Yeah. How did it happen for you?
Well, the horror community is an interesting community, first of all. for a lot of different reasons, but I don't want to get sidetracked. But so I'll say this: the way I got involved was when I really wasn't involved until I started writing. I wasn't really in that deep. I was reading horror novels, sure, but I wasn't really deep into communicating with writers or that kind of thing. And or other readers in the communities or anything like that. So, but when I started writing, you want to connect with other people who have been there and done that. But for me, the way it started was I was actually this is during my screenwriting years, and I reached out to a horror author because I wanted to option one of his stories for a screenplay. A guy named Laird Barron, who's an unbelievable horror writer and crime writer. He wrote a crime trilogy for Putnam. And through the course of him and I communicating with his representatives about optioning this novella, we kind of became friendly. And when I wrote my first story that I mentioned earlier, Mother, I had sent it to him. I said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" It's my first kind of shot at the genre. And he called me a couple weeks later, and we were on the phone for an hour, and he was just saying, "Dude, this is great. You can do this. This is a publishable story, and this is something you need to keep doing." And I was blown away. I was expecting him to say, "Don't give up the day job." And I still had all my notes. And then he proceeded to tear the story apart in all the best ways, right? Offering criticism and feedback, and I still have all my notes, from that. And I take all that stuff very much to heart because he's a professional. He's been doing it. He's respected, and I'm not one who shies away from criticism and critique. I love it. If you can tell me something that's going to make my story better, I want to hear it. I decide what goes in and what goes out. So ultimately, all that feedback is sorted through, and I pick the stuff that I agree with, and I discard the stuff I don't. But I never shy away from feedback. But so I came friendly with Laird, and then I published a couple stories, and that's when I started getting into the community. I went to a convention just to kind of shake hands and mill around. And I had my little chapbook with me, and I was kind of handing it out to people, and I had no idea what I was doing. But that's really how, and then I started and then I started communicating more with writers online and kind of get the social media thing going. And it's been, 7 years now since I really started writing for genre, for horror genre. And I've gone to, a handful of conventions since then, and I've become very friendly with so many writers. And it's a wonderful community. The readers are so, they're so into it, and the writers are so friendly and warm in this community and so supportive. The one thing I was going to say about the horror community is I write guest columns for a website called Book and Film Globe, and the editor is a guy named Neil Pollack, who's written a bunch of books, and he told me, I started writing horror stuff for him, and interview pieces and reviews and stuff like that. And he and he was very unfamiliar with the community, and he made a point to tell me at one point, he emailed me, and he's like, it's so refreshing to hear these, things you're doing, these interviews you're doing, and to see how the horror community supports each other. He goes, you don't see that in other writing communities. He goes, trust me, I know, and it can be cutthroat. And so I like to think that for whatever reason, horror is kind of like an open community. We're all very supportive of each other. Maybe it's because we're kind of like we're sort of the black sheep of the family. We're sort of the redheaded stepchild, as it were. And I think we kind of band together out of unity. But yeah, so it's a really great community of writers and readers, and I've had such a great experience with everybody. So it's been a blessing. And I've met people who have really helped me out, helped me not just with the writing, but understanding publishing, understanding how to be a professional, understanding etiquette, and I listen to all that stuff. I take it all in because I really strive to be like a professional writer, and I want to present myself well. So it's been a real learning curve, but it's been an incredible ride.
When someone takes home your book, reads it, what do you hope they take away from the book? I mean, besides the entertainment value or the suspense and horror and stuff like that, is there a subtext or is there something else you want people to get?
I'm not big into having an agenda with my writing, with my books. I know a lot of writers are. They're very into having an agenda, having something they want to say, quote unquote. And I just want to write the best book possible. And I want it to I was going to say I want them to be entertaining, and then you took that out of my answer. So, but
well, that's fine. I think because sometimes, for me, I mean, I've done 28 books, and I think that sometimes I look back, and sometimes there's things that get into the book. They get entered into the story without you knowing it. It's just organic, and you don't realize it until it's done. So I'm not just trying to suggest, okay, listen, I have an agenda. I want to talk about whatever, racism, and I'm going to put this. No, not necessarily that, because you can do that. But is there anything maybe organic, or do you see anything that comes out of your books?
Well, I was talking to somebody recently, and I was being interviewed by this woman, and she was, and it was for an educational thing, right? She was a teacher, and it was for, so it was kind of like an educational focused interview, and she said, what would people learn, like literally learn by reading your books? And I said, I don't think they're going to learn anything. Like, learn how to tie a good knot. I don't know. And what she said was interesting. She goes, but you're showing readers people that they may not have ever experienced. And that's learning. And I said, you're right. Showing different walks of life and different experiences and different voices. And, they're maybe, seeing sides of personalities that they may not be familiar with. They may be seeing cultures they're not familiar with. And I think, with my books, I think, that's probably the takeaway is I'm trying to give you, well, first of all, I'm trying to give you an emotional experience. The best reviews that I get, the ones that I really love seeing, are when people talk about the emotional connection they have to my books, which sounds a little funny because I write horror, but I do like people to feel when they're reading my stuff, and I want it to be something that grinds into the heart and kind of sticks there, and more than and on top of just being scary and fun and crazy and gory and all that stuff. So for me, I think the number one takeaway would be I would really hope that a reader would have an emotional response to a book I wrote or to a story that I wrote. That would be my number one thing. And then two, I want them to have fun. I mean, we live in such a dark world, and if you can have 2 hours or 3 hours a day or where you're just not thinking about bad stuff or not thinking about problems or the economy or politics, and you're just like enjoying a story, like that to me that's enough for me. That makes me very happy. I'm happy, that's more than enough for me to give people.
Well, the horror fiction boom of the 1980s kind of imploded by the mid-90s, and it's taken a long time, I guess, to resurface into the mainstream from the underground. Do you feel that horror fiction today is enjoying a resurgence?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a bit of a golden age, honestly. And I think it has something, I think it's twofold. This gets discussed a lot when I go to these conventions and stuff. And obviously we're all horror writers, so we're like, we're in a golden age, This is great. But because you're sort of isolated. But no, but it is. The more people I talk to and the more I see, there's so much, and when you look at like bookshelves in bookstores and when you see New York Times reviews and you see those kind of things, you see a lot more horror, And I think there's the three things that I would say that cause that is, one, I think streaming has created such an enormous wealth of content, and so much of it is horror, because it's, frankly, it's cheap to make, and, because you really just need to get the scares in there, but people are doing, filmmakers are doing really interesting things with horror, and I think they're showing viewers, consumers, that there's a wider, breadth of stuff here than just like the zombies and serial killers. There's some really interesting stuff going on in horror, and I think that's kind of carried over to fiction. And the other thing is, I think that because how easy it is to publish over the last decade, with print on demand and Amazon coming out so strong and all that stuff, I think there was a point where it kind of became oversaturated because everybody was publishing everything, but now it's kind of settled into sort of a groove. But there's a lot more voices out there right now. There's more diverse voices, more representation for people who may not have picked up a Stephen King book or a Dean Koontz book. So it's reaching more diverse audiences, which is a huge, huge, huge thing. And then the third thing, which may or may not be true, but it's something I think is, in a way, to your point, Alan, the golden age, was the 80s, right? And people like me were kids, and impressionable kids in the 80s, and now we're all in our 40s and 50s, and I think so we're kind of that boom, in a way, of all the kids that grew up with Stephen King and Dean Koontz and Clive Barker and Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween and The Thing and all that stuff, Jaws, go on and on. And that was such a crazy, time for horror. And now we're all adults, and we're kind of going back a bit to our roots, and I think we're exploring a lot of those childhood impressions. And I think so. That's kind of I think it's almost like a generational thing, would be the short way to say that. But yeah, I do think there's definitely a horror boom right now, and I hope it continues to grow because, high tide raises all boats, right? So I love when other writers succeed. I love seeing Barnes and Nobles having horror sections again, which they didn't have forever. So it's been a really interesting time for sure.
Friday the 13th, Part 3 in 3D. You remember that movie?
Well, I remember Jaws 3D.
Jaws 3D is, yeah.
Yeah. They had a Jason. Part 3 was 3D.
I'm sure. There was
these girls wanted to go to it, so I had to go.
There was a 3D boom there for a hot minute, right? Like in the 90s, I think. Early 90s.
Yeah, it always has a little spot once in a while, and So, one book, someone that's never heard of you before, which is really, frankly, hard to believe, but there might be a person out there that doesn't know what kind of writer you are. So if you had one book to choose to say, well, read this and you'll get a good impression of what kind of a writer I am, which one book would you tell them to read?
It sounds like a plug, but honestly, it's this novel that's coming out on the 25th of October, A Child Alone with Strangers, because for one thing, it's my first novel. So everything that I have out to date has either been short story collections or short, novellas, which is a very short novel or a long short story, depending on how you look at it. And those are all out there, but the reality is novels are, mountainous compared to short story collections. They're apples and oranges. Short story collections just don't have the reach or the readership of a novel. So I think this novel is a great gateway to my work because it's a big 600-page crime horror hybrid. It's a lot of fun, but I think it introduces you to my style of writing, introduces you to my style of storytelling, and I think it's a very solid example of the breadth of my other work. It's like there's some stuff that's a little more on the traditional horror side, or on the the kind of more like the kind of traditional side of horror that you might think about when you think of horror. And then there's some stuff that's more literary, that's more like a thriller. I've written science fiction, so I write a lot of different things. So, but I think this is a good example where it kind of encompasses all those different elements of my work to date. So I'd say definitely start with this novel, and then I have a couple novels that are primed to come out in the next 8 or 9 months here. So, but this is, I think, the best way to start.
Well, so how do people find Philip? Like, what kind of information do you want to give out here? Do you have a website, social media? you surface on apps somewhere like, Grindr or something like that, or what? Where do people find Philip Fracassi? Like, give us that information.
Well, unfortunately, I don't do TikTok, and I wish to God I did because, man, what a platform! But I don't dance, so. But yeah,
well, get your dog, and sit on the screen and let him do the work.
I have 2 cats, and if I can just get them to do some funny stuff, that might be the way to go. They're not funny cats. They're they're very serious cats, so they're boring. No, thank you. A website is the best way. I have a website is pfracassi.com, and I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So you can find me all those places, and you can contact me through my website, or you can reach out to me via any of those social media platforms. I love engaging with readers and talking to folks. So those are all good ways to find me if you want to find me. And my work is everywhere. It's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the usual places.
Well, of course, and we'll have everything up on our website so people can find it and find you easily. We'll even put your phone number up.
Please, and my home address? Perfect.
Oh, yeah, sure, why not? Give it to you. Well, it's been a pleasure. So now the book we've been talking about is A Child Alone with Strangers, a novel. And it's written by our guest, Philip Fracassi. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Yeah. Good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.